Stop right there. I know what you're thinking. Disasters are bad luck, freak coincidences, cosmic mischief. But most of the nightmares on this list weren't random. They were the direct result of one tiny, stupid decision, a blink-and-you're-doomed moment that turned an ordinary day into a public horror show. Over the next half hour, I'm going to show you 15 disasters that started because someone chose convenience, cost, ego, or laziness. You think catastrophe is unavoidable, but actually it's often preventable and embarrassingly human. You think nuclear meltdowns are the result of monster reactors, but the Chernobyl disaster began with human hubris and a disabled safety system. Operators wanted to run a late-night test and turned off automatic protections, chasing a procedure without respecting the reactor's tantrums. When the reactor screamed back, it wasn't a brave scientific failure. It was a combustible lesson in arrogance, steam and graphite igniting into an inferno that punched a hole through safety culture. You think radiation is invisible and clinical, but Chernobyl smelled, tasted, and coated the world with a sticky, metallic panic that hung in the air like burnt pennies. Fallout made forests into silent cathedrals and radios into biohazardous relics, while workers got a dose of mortality measured in sieverts. The decision to ignore procedure didn't just cause an explosion. It turned towns into time capsules of contamination. You think engineering is bulletproof when tests say otherwise, but the Challenger disaster began because managers chose schedule over warnings. Engineers begged to delay the launch over cold weather O-ring concerns and were ignored by a decision chain that valued PR and timetables. When rubber seals failed, it wasn't a mystery of physics. It was a cheap little joint turning a triumph of technology into a shredded plume. You think rocket disasters are abstract math, but the Challenger breakup was intimate and grotesque. Rubber turned traitor and exploded like a paper party hat in a furnace. Bodies, briefcases, and schoolchildren's experiments were catapulted into the sky as televised spectacle. Grief was immediate and national, like a physical blow. The single managerial decision to ignore engineers made safety into a rumor and turned a launch into a pub. You think the Titanic sank because of a giant iceberg strike sent by fate, but the ship's captain chose speed and prestige over caution. The White Star Line's push to break records and the decision to steam full tilt through iceberg-littered waters turned the vessel into a steel meat grinder. Instead of slowing or heedfully scanning, they gambled with human lives, turning an avoidable collision into one of history's most romantic. You think rich passengers got priority by design, but the bigger screw-up was a lifeboat plan that assumed nobody would need all those boats. The decision to cram grand salons into space that could have held safety gear and to equip the ship with too few lifeboats because rules were outdated turned a collision into a slow, theatrical drowning. Class and comfort beat contingency, and the result was people flung into. You think drilling accidents are because of unpredictable geology, but Deepwater Horizon was basically human chess played with poor moves. Managers ignored a failed pressure test and pushed ahead. The decision to interpret a screwy negative pressure test as close enough and to sacrifice caution for speed let hydrocarbons kiss the wrong plumbing. The result turned a rig into a dinner table for fire, oil, and misery. You think oil spills are neat scientific problems, but Deepwater Horizon made the sea into a sticky, smothering soup of life-suffocating mud. Birds became walking tar sculptures, coastlines turned into fossilized nightmares, and entire local economies inhaled petroleum like a slow poison. The single decision to ignore red flags turned a manageable leak into an ecological meltdown that read like a cautionary tale. You think industrial accidents are dramatic acts of nature, but Bhopal was the result of corporate laziness and a single neglectful decision to skimp on maintenance and safety. Management turned off safety systems to save money and left a toxic gas cloud literally waiting in the wings. When methyl isocyanate escaped, it rolled through sleeping neighborhoods like an invisible tsunami, suffocating thousands and leaving a city permanently scarred. You think gas is just a stinging joke, but Bhopal's plume acted like a silent, oily blanket that soaked lungs and eyes until organs failed. Hospitals were swamped, babies were born sick, and decades later the soil and water still taste like corporate sin. The crucial decision to disable safeguards didn't just release gas. It released a multi-generational wound that smells faintly of injustice and poor accounting. You think nuclear fallout is only for mad scientists, but Fukushima owes everything to a bureaucratic decision about where to put backup generators. Engineers and regulators built safety systems on low ground that a tsunami could reach, because it had never happened before, seemed like a plan. When the wave hit, it turned redundancies into relics, and the plant went from safe to radioactive like a car catching fire from a single spark. You think radiation leaves obvious traces, but Fukushima turned landscapes into subtle, insidious deserts where nature looked fine and still hid poison. Farms and rooftops were ghostly, children's toys lay in silent yards, and cleanup was a slow, costly choreography of containment. The single design decision to ignore maximum tsunami risk didn't just break reactors. It broke trust and left communities adrift in metals and memory. You think big blimps are harmless nostalgia, but the Hindenburg disaster began with a cost-saving decision to use hydrogen instead of inert helium. That one choice turned a graceful passenger giant into a floating gasoline stove the moment a spark kissed its skin. It wasn't some cosmic irony. It was a business decision that let a molecule of hydrogen turn a lavish pride ride into one of the most photogenic conflagrations of the 20th century. You think the disaster was cinematic on purpose, but it became part of modern horror because of cheap choice and public spectacle. The blaze unspooled like candle wax across fabric, and newsreel microphones captured people turning to ash and smoke under a sky of flame. The decision to risk hydrogen for profit made the catastrophe an emblem of modern hubris and a smell that clung to headlines for generations. You think design trade-offs are academic, but the Ford Pinto disaster started because executives decided it's cheaper to pay damages than fix a leaky gas tank. Someone literally did the math and chose human lives as a line item on a spreadsheet. The result was cars that exploded like birthday candles in rear-end collisions, turning family sedans into funeral pyres and proving that ethics can't be balanced on a calculator. You think molasses is just syrup for pancakes, but the Boston molasses flood happened because someone decided saving on steel and inspection was fine until a tank exploded and turned a neighborhood into brown soup. The sticky wave flung horses and barrels like toys, smothering people and streetcars in a gruesome, gloopy mess. It was a bizarre, viscous catastrophe born from penny pinching and structural. You think bridges fall because of giant storms, but Tacoma Narrows collapsed because engineers ignored a silly-sounding aerodynamics problem. Flutter. They designed a lovely, skinny bridge that sang when the wind hit it, and someone decided that graceful form mattered more than stability. The deck started bouncing like a living thing until the whole structure disintegrated into the water. A quiet, mechanical death caused by aesthetic hubris and bad physics assumptions. You think engineering is just math, but Tacoma Narrows was a lesson in what happens when architects win over structuralists and nobody listens. The slender deck and aesthetic choices amplified wind into a monster that resonated like a tuning fork, and maintenance protocols were basically a shrug. The collapse looked almost elegant on film, but it was the triumphant victory of form over function with gravity as the final critic. You think workplace disasters are freak accidents, but the Triangle Shirtwaist fire hinged on one ugly managerial decision: locking the doors to stop theft and unauthorized breaks. Those welded exits turned escape routes into teeth of a trap when flames licked stairwells and smoke swallowed corridors. People jumped from windows in a human fountain, and the industry learned the hard way that security theater should never replace real safety measures. You think tragedies pass quickly, but Triangle's aftermath rewrote labor laws and safety codes because one stupid decision had such a loud price. The city watched workers fall like rag dolls, and reformers turned grief into regulations that still keep us alive today. It was an ugly calculus. Lock a door to protect property, and you might wind up costing dozens of lives and an entire industry its conscience. You think foreign policy disasters are complex webs, but the Bay of Pigs invasion boiled down to one political decision: greenlight a half-baked, deniable plan to topple Castro. Planners underestimated local support, overestimated rebellion, and left air cover as a political face-saving wink. The result was humiliating defeat, prisoners, and a diplomatic mess that taught Washington that covert shortcuts can explode into public fiascos. You think a single defeat is forgettable, but the Bay of Pigs left a scar of distrust and emboldened opponents who smelled weakness. The decision to stage a deniable invasion blew open America's cloak-and-dagger image and fed Cold War tensions for years. It proved that political convenience can fracture strategy, and that one rushed yes from the top can cost credibility, lives, and future options in a single, humiliating day. You think battlefield heroics write themselves, but the charge of the Light Brigade was a classic administrative facepalm. A single miscommunicated order sent men to their deaths. Commanders misread reports and passed an instruction that turned a glorious cavalry charge into a slaughter down a valley loaded with cannons. The mistake was bureaucratic, absurd, and spectacularly deadly, proof that in war, clarity of command is literal life insurance. You think bravery redeems mistakes, but that charge shows how heroism can become a tragic accounting error when orders are fuzzy. Riders returned in ragged clumps, horses dead, and strategy shredded like cloth, leaving families to read poems about courage in between funeral notices. A single garbled order didn't just cost tactical advantage. It cost human flesh and turned a military blunder into a cultural wound remembered for its pointless grace. You think ship sinkings are dramatic storms, but the herald of free enterprise capsized because someone forgot to close the bow doors. One careless step on paperwork, and the ferry took on water like a bathtub left running. Within minutes, the car deck became a watery trap, and the ship rolled, turning a routine harbor departure into a chaotic drowning caused by a single human slip. Sleepy oversight? You think modern ships are foolproof, but leaving loading doors open let the sea waltz right onto the deck and break the ship's balance. Vehicles slid, fumes mixed with seawater, and passengers who thought it was a small error found themselves pinned in a sinking metal belly. The one forgotten check turned a commute into a nightmare, teaching maritime crews that tiny routine tasks. You think oil spills come from giant mistakes, but Exxon Valdez's blow-up started with a captain who chose a shortcut while drinking. He left the shipping lane and hit a reef, and a single lapse of judgment produced one of the largest oil disasters in history. The spill wasn't an inevitability. It was a human story of fatigue, hubris, and alcohol turning careful navigation into a... You think an oil spill is a temporary stain, but Exxon Valdez smothered coastlines and livelihoods in a thick, persistent film that resisted scrubbers and patience. Birds turned into stained ornaments and fisheries were choked for years, while legal fights stretched into a bitter cultural scar. One captain's reckless choice didn't just spill oil. It poured long-term damage into ecosystems and human community. You think structural collapse means unforeseeable forces, but Tacoma and similar bridge failures start with arrogant design choices, making something pretty and hoping physics will behave. Engineers who prioritize aesthetic slimness over stability create a perfect stage for nature to exploit. When wind finds a sympathetic frequency, the whole structure sings itself apart. A sobering reminder that beauty without engineering is a public safety. You think disasters are always dramatic reveals, but often they're a slow build of ignored signals. A valve leaking, an alarm silenced, a cheap weld. That tiny negligence can let pressure build and oxidizers mingle until one spark writes a new headline. The moral is boring but brutal. Small, avoidable choices compound into monstrous outcomes when the system is... You think regulations prevent disasters, but budget cuts and cursory inspections turn those rules into theater. Companies pick the cheapest bids, auditors glance at boxes, and the result is steel tanks that look solid until seamstress seams let go. When old metal gives up, it's not cinematic. It's a slow mechanical betrayal that dumps contents into... You think disasters stem from a lone madman, but often corporate culture is the real villain that enables the dumb decision. Celebrating margins and deadlines while ignoring boring safety memos makes neglect inevitable. It's not malice, it's process. When those celebrations are prioritized over shutdowns, the result is a predictable chain reaction. Savings now, catastrophe later, and a PR team put to work on character. You think history's great collapses are epic inevitabilities, but many turn on small decisions. One failed alliance, one ignored envoy, one betrayed oath. Those single moments ripple outward like a pebble in a pond, eventually toppling empires and redefining borders. The point is painful. Big outcomes often have tiny, human-sized causes and understanding that makes the past feel closer. You think disasters are exotic anomalies, but the through line here is depressingly consistent. Someone chose short-term gain, pride, or laziness over caution. Whether it's a sealed valve, a green light, or a single misread order, these choices compound until the only place left to pay is the public square. Remembering the pattern matters because prevention is less dramatic but far more effective, and it usually starts with lists. You think warning signs are subtle, but the ones that matter are clear if you know to look. Disabled alarms, budget cuts, PR deadlines pressed against safety checks, and managers who treat engineers as optional. These red flags are boring, not cinematic, and that's exactly why they get ignored. If you're in a position to slow a process down, do it. Prevention is a whisper that saves lives. Unless you think fixing systemic risk is expensive or slow, but it's cheaper and kinder than the alternative. One stupid decision can cost more than a lifetime of prudent choices combined. If there's a takeaway, it's this. Treat small safety steps like sacred rituals, not bureaucratic annoyances, because those tiny habits are the difference between normal days and historical horror shows. If this ruined your appetite, subscribe.